Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted you're here. I think I'm probably the only person in Washington that woke up at 4 in the morning excited about this program, you know? This is the kind of stuff that stirs my blood, and this was what I most enjoyed. Of all my professional experiences, I most enjoyed being in the department, being in the Comptroller's office. And so it was great fun to have these gents here, and we're going to have a very good morning talking. This is, to my knowledge, the first time that we've ever brought the three proponents of PPB together, you know, for a program: planning, programming, and budgeting. This was a management innovation, of course, that was brought to us by McNamara, Secretary McNamara. Now, this was over 45 years ago. It still is the foundation for the coherence of decision-making in the department. People who have not been in the building, have not been working the building, don't realize the importance, significance of this process. And it has strategic coherence, and it's one of the reasons why the Defense Department's budget is quite coherent. I mean, we're able to wrap up the year with probably a 97, 98% success rate getting support from the Congress. But it's because there's this very deep process that we put ourselves through. It's enormously inefficient, you know, just consumes astounding amount of hours, but it does bring together, if you're trying to say, how do you bring together, you know, a department that has to manage 70 years of technology, for example. You have to keep B-52s flying, and you have to plan on an airplane that will be around for the next 40. I mean, how do you do that? It's a department that has the largest daycare center provider in the world. It has the largest amount of rolling stock of any institution in the world. I mean, so how do you bring all of that together and make it coherent that you can defend it publicly? And that's really what these three gentlemen do professionally. And so we thought it would make for a very interesting program to bring them together, especially since nobody in the government is doing anything these days. I mean, so we're going to have to do it for them. This is something that we need the American people to know and to understand. And so I'm delighted to have them here. I'm going to let Todd lead the way. He can introduce them and share with you, because there's a sequence. I think we're going to go PPBS. Is that how we're going to do it today? So this was going to be refreshing. And would you please welcome these colleagues with your applause?
Thank you, Dr. Hamre, and I really want to thank our distinguished guest for joining us here this morning. I think this may be the first time that we've had this brain trust assembled at a public event ever before, perhaps. And so I want to start, as Dr. Hamre said, we'll go in order of planning, programming, and budgeting, as you see here, from my left to my right. So I'll start with Bob Scher, who is Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities. I got the whole title right.
There you go.
It will not fit into a tweet.
Not well.
I'll tell you that. And so we'll let you go first and give us kind of the strategic framework behind this budget request.
Sure, happy to, and thank you. I'm honored to lead off. We like to think that we in policy and strategy often lead off, and actually, frankly, with this secretary, I think I will make the case that, in fact, we have. Thanks to John and Todd, obviously, for bringing us all together. When you go through this process, when Secretary Carter got here, it was pretty clear that he had he assessed that there was a new security environment. He wanted to figure out, how do you change and adapt the budgeting process for dealing with that new security environment? And he really gave us a very clear direction on the strategic imperative excuse me, of putting forward a budget that ensures that our military is postured to deter, and if unable to effectively deter, win the nation's wars. He also was very clear about ensuring that we looked at 5, what he called, evolving challenges. And I hope that you all have read the transcript and from his testimony. There's some great stuff in there. You'll hear a lot of it repeated here. And that really, we needed to be able to drive DoD's force planning and budgeting, looking both near-term issues and long-term issues based on those 5 challenges. As I think everyone knows, but to repeat them here: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and counterterrorism globally. And he was also pretty clear that you can't choose which one's more important. Now, certainly one of the key areas to focus on, he believed in this budget, was to say that great power conflict is something that we hadn't done as much work on as we had done on other issues in the past, and he wanted to clearly have a focus on that. But also that at any point in time, the United States should expect, the people of the United States should expect that the department can deal with any one of these 5 challenges. That with a $583 billion budget, which is with OCO what we put up on the Hill. Sorry, Mike, I know that's your line, but and that we need to be able to say that we can do more than one thing, and more than one thing at a time, and be able to address all of these challenges. So he consciously didn't want to prioritize them. So I'm going to give a quick overview again and take a look at this, talk about the security environment, and then hand it over. So first, I think the budget you'll see, and we'll talk about, clearly reinforces the direction to make the military more full spectrum. So while we had 15, 14 years of dealing with and almost singularly focused on the very important role of forces that were in harm's way, that were in conflict doing the wars and the war fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, this budget, I would argue, continues a trend, but continues it more directly and more consciously on understanding that we have to look at new things and new ways of doing things to deal with great power adversaries and the security environment we have. Another big focus, which is in the budget but also is outside of the budget that I wanted to talk to you, make sure you understand and get, is the innovative ways, new concepts. How you deal with these risks is going to have to be different. As the Secretary said, we're not going to fight these the same way we always thought about fighting them 10, 15, 20 years ago. We have to be innovative and look at new approaches. Third, a lot about that you'll hear about is balance. And I think we look at this balance in 2 different ways. One is the balance in the mix of capability, capacity, and readiness for each of the military services. And generally, the direction was, when in doubt, bias towards modernization and recovering readiness rather than force structure. That wasn't universally applied because every case is a little bit different for each of the services based on what they've done and how their challenges are, but that was a general focus. And then the second part is balance between resourcing today's fights and preparing for the future threats and conflicts. Key to this is that we will not be able to prevail in a future conflict against a great power if we don't start thinking, planning about it now and today. So when the Secretary talks about warfighting posture in the budget and the joint force, he's really talking about being able to deter and, if necessary, prevail against our most advanced competitors. And really that relies on having and being seen to have by all the ability to dominate a conflict that any aggressor would choose to initiate. But I think there's been a lot of talk about this, and I want to be clear that warfighting posture is not intended to be at the expense of global presence. This global presence is critical to assure our allies to be able to understand what we need to have in the region, to be able to, whatever region that may be, to be able to bring forces into the region from elsewhere. And so these things go hand in hand. The most credible way to make sure that you have the deterrence is to know that you can win, but to know how you win, who you'll work with, and how you'll get there. Now, the other piece of this is that the budget really does look at things that we're doing today. We understand we're engaged in many fights today, and there is much in the budget that looks at that. But there is, in fact, a gradual shift in relative terms from a force focused solely on today to one that also is being able to deal with these future risks. So as I look at the multiple regions, and we also know that a part of this is figuring out how do you do more than one thing at a time. Again, the Secretary has 5 things. You got to be able to do any one of them, but you need to be able to deal with multiple conflicts at any one time. As you're looking at this, we've really prioritized, as I said, these key posture pieces and key investments where we have had the ability to make modifications in the budget. Some of these key capabilities are very focused on anti-access and area denial threats, including investments in our posture in Europe, modernizing fighter and attack aircraft, the lethality of the undersea force, research and development, and these other things that Jamie and Mike will talk to you about. But again, one thing which I know is a big focus, and you've all heard a lot about, is the third offset strategy. And I think this budget reinforces the Secretary's guidance to figuring out how we can offset some of the key capabilities that our adversaries and potential adversaries are building, and how can we get over those sort of the problems we face there in either its numerical issues or salvo competition. And are we going to be able to come up with new technologies, but also operations and organizational constructs to achieve advantages that significantly challenges the competitor's desire to limit our reach and to not allow us to have access to those environments. So we also, I think I can talk more, but we also have a lot about allies and posture and how we're working with allies, interoperability, and what our posture looks like. Some of the most notable stuff and largest stuff going on in Europe, but continuing posture issues in the Asia Pacific. So let me quickly try to get to each of the 5 challenges just a little bit. I think Russia, I think this budget really took stock of the profound shift underway in the European security environment and what Russia is doing to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighboring countries. So figuring out what we do to deal with Russia in the near term and the long term was a huge focus for us. We obviously have to work with our allies and partners. The strength of the NATO alliance is something that has shown its worth throughout the years, and we will continue to do that. A lot of what we are doing to support the near-term pieces is through the European Reassurance Initiative. While this was started last year, it was really bumped up over 300% in terms of budget figures for this coming year. $3.4 billion for ERI, and above I think we did $789 million last year. So this looks to do increasing military presence, Armor Brigade Combat Team, an Army Rotational Combat Aviation Brigade, as well as pre-positioned combat support and service support enablers in a heel-to-toe fashion in the region. Also looking at making investments in infrastructure, especially airfields, to be able to account for the rapid deployability that we want to see. We're keeping some Air Force units there through ERI forces. Also, rotational deployments and exercises, we're trying to step that up to increase interoperability with traditional friends and allies. And long term, we're looking at advanced power projection capabilities in the A2AD environment that I know Jamie and Mike will talk about at greater length. These are useful for both, in many cases, for both Russia and Chinese advanced capabilities, but in some cases you have to tailor them to the environment, ground environment, A2AD versus the more maritime. Also, there's going to be some prepo that we're looking at within ERI to move forward. China, we continue to work to ensure that as part of our rebalance to Asia, which is not all about China, but is also partly about dealing with the potential adversary that we could see in China based on their behavior and their capability and what they are building. And clearly, they continue to look to try to deny access and restrict our freedom of movement in the area. So we need to take a look, and have done so over the past number of years, and continue to look at where we have advantages and where we can do things such as engaging targets at standoff range, emphasize our undersea capabilities, make bets on future technology that will be useful. We are going to continue and have continued in this budget to move forward on posture issues in the Asia-Pacific region. We'll continue with Australia. The Philippines recently just came to the legal determination that EDCA continues to be useful, that is legal, and we'll look to building more infrastructure and access along with our partner, our ally in the Philippines. And we'll continue thinking of things about dispersing our forces around, making sure we have multiple areas to operate from, and dealing with the salvo competition there in terms of both how do you defend, but also how do you look at hardening and other pieces for survivability in the Pacific. Iran and North Korea, these are long-standing places we've looked at. We are going to continue to make these investments, and especially there's some targeted ones in each cases that are useful for particular problems. But in general, we feel pretty good about these environments and what we can accomplish, as well as some of the advanced technology that we think about may be driven primarily by Russia and China as potential adversaries will obviously have an impact in these environments. And finally, we did not forget about fighting global terrorism. It is an ongoing condition and is where we have forces still in harm's way and where we must have place of priority focus. And there are a lot of pieces in this budget, from ISR, munitions, weapon systems, and looking at our future posture of how you deal with this, what will be an ongoing, and I'd argue generational, set of conflicts in and around this area of instability. So with that, I will leave it off to Jamie and for others to continue.
Well, thank you, Bob. And Todd, appreciate you organizing this event, and certainly Dr. Hamre's kind introduction. It is a little daunting to do an unprecedented talk at CSIS, because I think every talk ever conceived has been done here over the years. But it's great to be with two good friends here and to have a chance to represent the second P in the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process. This is a little bit of an odd spot for me because, as some of my friends in the audience will recall, I started my Pentagon career working in the organization that Bob now leads in policy, and my first job in the Obama administration was as the Comptroller of the Air Force. So I've had the budgeting and execution piece, I've had the planning and policy piece and strategy piece, but now I'm charged with the interstitial, the programming. And programming is probably the piece that is least familiar to folks who are not immersed in our Department of Defense minutia and our processes. But it's really about connecting the broad goals of our strategy and of our operational planning with the capabilities, the capacity, and the readiness that's required to carry them out. It's about delivering comprehensive deterrence for the nation so that we can secure a beneficial peace for the American people and for the world. But in essence, what that means is I have to argue with both these gentlemen regularly. I have to argue with Bob when he's not being detailed enough, and I have to argue with Mike when he's being far too detailed and focused on minutia. But in all seriousness, it's a process that necks down from broad objectives through to the specific dollars and cents that instantiate them. And it is a process the department's been using now for over 50 years through various changes. It's a process that we have been working inside the department to reboot, to revamp, to improve. And part of what we are trying to do is tighten that linkage from strategy all the way through to budget, which is part of why you see the three of us spending a lot more time together than perhaps has sometimes been the case. But what are the details that make up that tying of resources to strategy, that tying of resources to the outcomes that the nation needs? As Bob indicated, we had to start with critical objectives, and one of the things that we had that was enormously powerful in the budget cycle, the program budget cycle that was just concluded, was clear and early guidance from the Secretary of Defense as to the strategic priorities. He gave us that guidance early enough that we could charter some very specific and focused analytic efforts to get at the critical questions that turned into the details of the budget. So our Deputy Secretary, responding to the SecDef's guidance, was able to charter 6 strategic portfolio reviews last year. And those strategic portfolio reviews were deliberately designed to reach across the different structures of the department. So not limited to one service, not limited in most cases to one domain, not limited to one weapon system or one appropriations line item. They were designed to reach across all of the components. I'll talk just about one of those today to give you a flavor of how those informed the budgetary decision making that Mike ultimately led. And I'm enormously grateful to the work of my team in cost assessment and program evaluation as they co-led these 6 strategic portfolio reviews with different stakeholders across the department, because these really were the department's analytical crown jewels for this last cycle and were core to us aligning resources to the most critical challenges facing the department. So the one I'd like to talk about in a little bit of detail today is power projection. And the reason that we had a strategic portfolio review on power projection this year, building on power projection analysis done in the previous 2 cycles as well, is because we know the department has to be able to field the right capabilities in a sufficient quantity in order to provide that comprehensive deterrence for adversaries and potential adversaries around the world. Potential adversaries need to understand and be very cognizant of the capabilities the United States can bring to bear if we need to defend allies, if we need to defend American interests. And whether or not those capabilities are up to the snuff and make that potential adversary think twice is really at the heart of global deterrence. There were three major thematic findings in the Power Projection Strategic Portfolio Review that really got to the heart of how we invested our capability dollars this cycle. First, it placed a great emphasis on the ability of the United States to deliver effects from range. There's a lot of talk in Washington and military communities about anti-access area denial and what it means. Parts of that are perhaps overhyped, but parts of that are very real. And one way that the United States can counter that is with long-range capabilities. The second critical theme is about disaggregating complex systems, extremely expensive systems, extremely valuable systems, extremely precious systems, into simpler elements in order to carry out military tasks. And there you will see, as we turn to the program and the budget, some more speculative investment. The third principle is to leverage areas of sanctuary. Again, if others are seeking to keep you out so that you cannot defend allies or defend interests, it's important to be able to act from domains or from means where you enjoy relative sanctuary. Bob mentioned the work and thinking in the department on what we're calling the third offset strategy. While this power projection strategic portfolio review was not designed to prove or demonstrate the third offset strategy, you can clearly trace some of the same lines and some of the same thinking really tying into how we constructed that portfolio review and the findings that came out of it. Let me tick through a few of the specifics, and again, I think Mike will talk about the how things were instantiated in the budget in a little more detail. One of the things that the programming process brings to the table and that we lay forward is the longer term look at the future. Mike and his team are understandably heavily focused on the budget year and the execution year and whatever request we're currently defending in front of the Congress, which is a lot of different things to keep your mind on. My team and my element of the process is really heavily focused on a balance across a 5-year and sometimes longer horizon, giving us a planning horizon far enough out that you can start to see new technologies and weapon systems come in. So I'll talk to a little bit of that longer horizon here. To emphasize both the sanctuary piece and the delivering effects from range piece, I'd highlight one specific domain example, which is what this program and budget do in the undersea. That's an area of extraordinary advantage for the United States, an area where we enjoy a relative sanctuary, an area where we have technological advantages built up over decades that give us extraordinary capability. So you see across the Future Years Defense Plan over $40 billion of additional investment in American undersea capabilities. That's an increase of about $2.5 billion relative to where we were. And that money goes, of course, to fielding more submarines, more of our state-of-the-art Virginia-class submarines. It goes to the initial stages of modernizing the undersea nuclear deterrent with the Ohio Replacement Program. But we also take some very specific additional steps that I wanted to highlight. One extremely important one is the investment in what we call the Virginia Payload Module. Virginia Payload Module is really an extended cab version of your standard Virginia attack submarine. And it's an extraordinarily high leverage one, because while the run-of-the-mill Virginia offers you 12 vertical launch tubes, the Virginia Payload Module version offers you 40. So more than treble the shooting capacity, as well as capability to support a whole host of other special missions and weapon systems. That's a big deal. And for a comparatively small additional investment, each one of those boats is going to be enormously more capable. We're But we're recognizing we can't sit on our laurels in the undersea, so you see us investing in additional upgrades to submarine combat systems. You see us investing in improved acoustics and sensing technology for our submarines, improved quieting for our submarines, improved torpedoes for our submarines, upgrading the Mark 48, which is our core heavyweight torpedo. And we're also looking towards unmanned capability. And the Virginia Payload Module will also give those submarines more capability to host various unmanned systems. You also, shifting from the undersea, see the threads of that strategic portfolio review playing out in several other domains. In the air domain, you see a focus on things like the arsenal plane, which the Secretary talked about. In the surface domain, you see, and subsurface, you see an important investment in expanding the capabilities of the Tomahawk missile, which is one of our most numerous missiles, an extremely effective missile. What the Secretary has announced with this budget rollout is that we will be upgrading and modifying the Tomahawk as it goes through its remanufacture in coming years to also give it a ship attack capability. An extremely important step to leverage a system that we have thousands of in order to deliver very serious war-winning effects should they be required. You also heard the Secretary talk about taking one of our premier surface-to-air missiles, the SM-6 Standard missile, which is used for ship-based air defense, and converting it to give it an anti-ship capability. So you have a extremely high-speed, high-energy missile that we're modifying for anti-ship capability, and then you have a low-level, low-flying Tomahawk missile, a dual threat for anti-ship. Again, taking systems we've got, making modest investments, leveraging them to really change strategic calculus to enhance deterrence. The second and final major point I'd make today is following on to the point Bob made about posture and presence. The department is constantly balancing our warfighting posture, our capability to fight and win at a moment's notice, with our presence around the world. And what we have seen is as the force has become somewhat smaller and as we've dealt with a pretty substantial shift as numbers have come down in the Middle East to around the world, we have an opportunity to reassess in relative terms how much of the force should be out and about at any one moment, how much of the force should be training and preparing to provide a stronger deterrence to a potential large fight. And we are, as Bob said, incrementally adjusting that balance. One of the critical pieces that falls into that category are the decisions the department made on the littoral combat ship in this budget and program. We made a determination that we would reduce the inventory goal for that program from 52 ships to 40, and that we would move towards a prompt down select to a single vendor there. That's a ship that we had purchased to play certain warfighting roles, but most predominantly to provide presence. And we had sized that fleet to essentially replace the mine countermeasures ships we have, the patrol coastal boats that we have, Cyclone class, and the already now retired frigates, the Perry class frigates. Largely then a force that was to be spread around the world providing presence. And because of how that program was designed, it was providing actually incrementally more presence than the historic fleet has, because we were able to maintain a higher tempo with those ships. As it turns out, a fleet of 40 of those is going to be fully capable of providing more presence than the legacy fleet it replaces. And important to note, the 40-ship fleet is fully adequate to perform the warfighting missions that we need that fleet to perform. You'll see some discussion out in the press and in public commentary about where is the requirement on that. The Navy has had for some years now a 52-ship total requirement, which embodies both the presence requirement and the warfighting requirement. The posture versus presence dialogue has led us to say we will size that fleet to the warfighting requirement and source the presence within that warfighting requirement. That should hopefully clarify some of the discussion that's been out there on that. And again, it's a matter of balance. We needed to make those adjustments in order to free up the resources to get the naval aviation enterprise right, to invest in some of those impressive munitions programs that we talked about just a moment ago, and to, in general, allow the department to protect readiness and investment in future capabilities. So I've talked in broad terms about how we translate strategy into program and then it turns into budget, and I've hopefully given you a few useful specifics, but I look forward to talking through the Q&A about any of the other pieces there, and in particular, how the department used the Secretary's construct of thinking concretely and directly about 5 challenges in order to focus our resources, because I think we've made some important steps in that regard as well. But with that, I will turn it over to Mike to put lipstick on this beautiful, beautiful budget that we have.
All right, thank you. And I should note, I realized I didn't actually introduce Jamie, Dr. Jamie Morin, Director of CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, and now Mike McCord, who is the Undersecretary of Defense, the
We
Comptroller.
prefer to conduct this incognito, but yes.
I've exposed who you are.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks to Dr. Hamre as well for introducing us and to you. It's good to be here with Jamie and Bob. It's unusual only that we're here in public because we meet and we work together all the time. We see each other just about every day.
There are windows here.
During the normal work week, there are windows here. I'm also happy to be here, at an institution that is so well known for thoughtful analysis and discussion, and that's something that is, always welcome. I'm going to ask a quick question how I do my own slides here.
You hit the arrows, it'll
Will
march
that thing
through.
work?
Yep.
Great. All right. So I'm going to recap just a little bit and put on paper a little bit, 1 or 2 points that have been made already. As both Bob and Jamie said, the primary thing that the Secretary used to grade our homework and to grade the budget this year was being responsive to the 5 challenges he saw. And again, as Bob said, there is a mixture of there's priority and there's not priority in these 5 challenges. The prioritization is, as he stated it, it's Russia, China, the near-peer competitors, the great power challenges first. That was clear. That's the priority. But the sense in which they're not prioritized is that it's not acceptable to say I can only afford to do 3 or 4 of these. We have to be able to do them all. We are going to be responsive to them all. In fact, one of the things that's striking to me is that the Secretary, any Secretary, I think, of Defense lives in the here and now a lot, spends a lot of time at the White House, a lot of time responding to what's going on today and to current challenges. But the Secretary has us thinking well into the future, as Jamie described. And if you look at what we're trying to accomplish in this budget, it really does span the domains. If you think about the 5 challenges in terms of geography, we're talking about Eastern Europe, we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about the South China Seas, we're talking about a good bit of the world's geography. We're talking about both from the here and now of the fight against terrorism to well into the future, how we're postured against other near-peer competitors. And I think we haven't talked about this yet in detail, but we recognize that a considerable part of our effort has to go and does go in our process, and especially in the programming process that Jamie leads, into going beyond the domains where we know we have to compete and win on air and in the sea and on land, but also to space and cyberspace. So pretty much every domain, every part of the world, and from now to the future, the Secretary is asking us to be and demanding that we be excellent across so many ranges of geography, time, and domains, something that I think few, if any, militaries would attempt to do what we attempt to do, let alone to excel at so much of it. So those are the 5 challenges really were the big lens through which we viewed many of the challenges in the budget. But we also talked about this morning that going beyond presence, which is important, and I think Bob put it well, it's not one or the other posture presence, but it's both. And what is posture on top of presence? It's the ability to get there. What can you bring? How quickly can you get there? How fast? How lethal? How much can you bring? As well as being there, being present, working with allies and partners on a daily basis. So again, we're not in an either-or mode of Russia or China, now or the future, posture or presence, but the relative emphasis is what the Secretary was trying to get into this budget and what we've tried to capture. Another thing that I think is important, again, innovation is a word you hear a lot, and there's really 4 parts of which I'm listing here on this slide just to talk about for a second. I think everybody's mind usually leaps to technology when you think about innovation, and that is certainly part of it. And again, third offset strategy, a phrase that is starting to become more well-known, is largely technological. And there's an aspect of especially reaching out, which the Secretary was doing just last week, to non-traditional, the Silicon Valley, say, people that don't directly do business with DoD in the way that you think of the major defense contractors doing. But innovation in the Secretary's mind and in the agenda that we have in this budget goes well beyond just new technology, as important as that is. Force of the future is the phrase that we have used, the Secretary uses to talk about innovating and how we attract and retain talent. And I think that that's proven so far to be a little bit easily misunderstood because our talent level is so high already. There are some who ask, well, why do we need to do anything new? Because it's working well what we do today. Secretary, I think, feels that as you look at what it takes to attract and retain someone today, what it's going to take to attract someone in the future, to 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, that we can't rest on our laurels. We have to think about how people today don't necessarily want the same things that people wanted 20 or 30 years ago when they joined, when the current senior level people in the department joined. Interesting aspect of this is just last year, a great degree of cooperation between an independent commission and the Congress and the department resulted in a military retirement reform, something that hasn't happened in 30 years. It's very much in line with the Secretary's thinking on what it takes to shape a force of the future. This is geared toward a more portable benefit, like the rest of the economy, already has moved to in the last 30 years. Something that allows the many people who don't stay 30 years to walk away with more than they do now. That's one of the aspects when you hear the Secretary talk about force of the future. A word that you'll hear used a lot is permeability, meaning how can someone come into the department? Could be other departments, but we're especially hoping they'll look at the Department of Defense, military or civilian. How can you serve your country for either a short time or a career? But especially if we can only maybe get part of your time to come in, come out. Portable benefits are obviously a part of that attracts people in the rest of the world, and we think can work for us. We've also talked about in recent days some of the non-monetary compensation benefits, child care hours, maternity and paternity leave expansion, things that recognize that what attracts and retains a person isn't always just their paycheck. Now, in terms of our budget, these benefits or these changes are not large drivers, the so-called force of the future, but they're important bets, and I think that they're well-placed bets. We've spent a lot of time on these at senior levels debating them, trying to think about what will keep us at the leading edge well into the future. Back to the innovation side, having new technology is important, of course, but if you use new tools and think the same old way, you're obviously not getting the most value out of them. And so how we think, and this is particularly Bob's area on our planning, reinvigorating wargaming are important priorities of both the Secretary and the Deputy. So new technology, but also new ways to use what you already have or new ways to use the new tools that you're hoping to acquire is important. And finally, how our own business processes work is again something the Secretary looks at the private sector and realizes that we can't, even if we were successful, say, in attracting new talent to the department, if they came here and found business processes that made no sense to them, that were slow, cumbersome, we might lose them again. So we need to be agile in how we operate, agile in how we think, as well as having new technology and the best people. So I think all of these are connected in our minds, that innovation is not just about new technology, as important as that is. Another point I'd like to make, we've talked about some of the proposals that probably got the most attention, like the European Reassurance Initiative. It's natural and it's normal to focus on the new thing in a budget, the thing that's maybe growing by the most percent. I would just like to remind people, though, that say the European Reassurance Initiative is not the sum total of our efforts to counter Russia. It sits on top of a presence that we've had in Europe for decades. It sits on top of the nuclear triad, other things that are important. So new categories, new label, it's natural to highlight areas of particular emphasis, and those are important, and there is a reason why that's probably the singular, most talked about part of this budget is the big increase in the European Reassurance Initiative, but it is not the sum total. And it's also true, and Dr. Morin gave a good example of Virginia Payload Module, among others, that with a few exceptions, most things in our budget are not, this is for or to counter Russia, this is for or to counter North Korea. Most of our systems are capable across a spectrum of capabilities, and that's how we look at them. So it's hard to come back at our budget later and say, what is your budget that is, how much of your budget goes to counter Russia? Well, that's not really how we do it, but it is important to look at the broad range of capabilities that we're bringing to bear. If I could go to...
I actually already got ahead of you.
Oh, you went ahead of me. Okay, the next slide. So I want to talk about just about the budget in its size, if you will, rather than the shape, which is mostly what the discussion today is about, the shape of the budget and the priorities inside the budget. Many people may have heard by now the Secretary describe himself as being either grateful for the deal, supportive of the budget deal from last fall. So I want to just take a second to talk about why is that? Why do we say that we support the budget deal? First of all, we had been stuck for 3 years prior to this deal at under $500 billion in our base budget, and I am going to focus on the base budget on this chart. We were able to get through this budget deal a jump of about $25 billion a year in 16 and 17, above the level we'd been at for the previous 3 years. So that's real resources here and now that gives us additional capability and gets us closer to where we need to be. Looking ahead to the future, of course, there will need to be more budget deals, more negotiations, more discussions in the future. This is a 2-year budget deal. It expires after this year, and it leaves the question open again for where we're going on defense resources. So we're starting from a better place by having this deal than if we had been stuck where we were before. So there's resources here and now. It's also a better jumping off point for the future. On this chart, you can see the blue bars on the bottom are the base budget, and that we have jumped up above the red lines. The space is about 20 to $25 billion in 16. Not quite as high a leap in 17 above where sequester would have been, but still an important increase. Very typical of recent budget deals where there's kind of a leveling off from the first year to the second year. Finally, the Secretary, the point he's made a couple times, and the reason he was calling early and often for compromise last year, is that compromise is how we govern in this country, and it represents progress to us to know what our top line is. Now, we didn't get this deal, as everybody knows, till early November. So we found out our FY16 top line 1 year into FY16. 1 month had already gone past of FY16 before we got that, and fairly late in our planning process, the process that all of us represent here was very far along by November when we got the final guidance on what the 17 top line would be. But still, that left us about 6 weeks to do a very focused effort to think about how to make the best choices to get the top line down to meet this deal and still represent the Secretary's priorities. Doing so gives us some near-term certainty and stability, which is important for our troops. If you don't, until you know for sure where the budget's going, people will wonder, maybe excessively, but they will wonder, are there going to be involuntary separations, things like that? What is my future? What does it mean for me and my family? Are we going to be able to stay in or not? It also gives us certainty that our industry partners need. Not the multi-year certainty that we really would wish, but at least it's some certainty about, and it's certainly better than the alternatives of sequesters and shutdowns, all of which we've experienced in recent years. So it's important for the troops, for our partners, for the planners inside the department to know what resources we have to work with, and for our partners around the world. So that, I think, is what the Secretary means when he says he supports this deal. He does not mean it in the sense that we got everything we wanted. Clearly, we did not. We had to take resources down in both 16 and 17, and we can talk about in the Q&A period of what choices we made. But we recognize that was always a possible outcome when you're seeking a compromise, that you might not get everything you wanted. And then finally, if I could go to my last chart. One thing that I think I just want to state is an important part of this process, and looking at our budget, is an unstated assumption that we made the choices as I described in the late part of last year, six weeks or so between early November and Christmas, with the belief that our top line would bounce back up in the future. If you look at this chart and you see the lines that are colored in this particular chart, blue and purple and green, That's our profile that we had for the FY15 budget, for the FY16 budget, and now for the FY17 budget. Other than accommodating the particular reductions in the budget deal from last fall, we've been remarkably consistent, more consistent than any team I know of, really, in saying here's the resources that we need. And there's a good reason for that. Some of the things that Bob has described, what we would normally call our ends, like the Asia-Pacific rebalance, have remained fairly constant goals of ours across the last couple of years. The things that we need to accomplish them with, in particular the size of the force, has remained fairly constant in our plans. Not to say the Army hasn't been reducing some while the other services have stayed fairly constant, but the rate at which the Army is reducing, the end state to which we plan to reduce the Army, has been pretty constant. That hasn't moved around a lot. So therefore, the so-called means, the resources, have also been pretty constant in our plan, pretty stable, I should say. So we have, for several years now, been very clear about the level of resources we think we need to accomplish our tasks and our missions, and we've stuck with that. So we didn't get all that we wanted in this budget deal, as I said, but we've made a big jump up. We made a big jump up from where we had been stuck for 3 years, which is that kind of flat reddish line across the bottom of this chart for 13, 14, and 15. Didn't get all the way up to the $35 billion increase that we had sought, but we made well over, we made about 2/3 of the jump. That positions us well, I think, for the next year or so. We need to make another jump in 18 of about that size to get back up to where we think we need to be, which is where those three lines kind of overlap. So we see the biggest risk in this budget, not so much as the choices that we made to meet the short-term budget reductions in this budget deal, although we're certainly happy to discuss and defend those. And I know that we're going to be asked about them. We have been in the hearings so far. We will be in the rest of the hearings that follow throughout the year. But the greater risk to us is the $100 billion that is the difference between any of those three lines, the blue, purple, and green ones, and the red line, which represents the 4 years remaining of the Budget Control Act caps. That's about $25 billion a year in extra resources. So again, we need to make another leap up next year, the department does, whether any of us are still here or not, to get up to that level again that the department's been advocating. And so that, I think, gives you a good indication of where we will remain throughout the end of this administration, saying the level of resources that we need. So with that, let me wrap up, and then we can talk about any of the individual programs and choices that we made, and talk about the OCO more, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about that as well.
All right. Thank you all for those great comments starting us off. Now, we'll go to questions from the audience in just a minute. I think we have some handheld mics in the room that we'll bring around. But I want to kick it off with some questions for each of you. And Bob, maybe you want to start with this one. One of the things that's been talked about a lot recently is this idea of improving the department's strategic agility. And so, by that, we mean the ability to adjust strategy rapidly as the world environment changes. A great example, of course, the 2014 QDR. Before the ink could even dry, we had Russia rolling into eastern Ukraine. We had ISIS expanding its territory. The world was changing. And of course, the Department of Defense has to change to keep up with it. So from your perspective, what is the department doing to improve its strategic agility, and what else needs to be done?
So I think I'm going to try to, I'll answer that from two different perspectives. One is that, we obviously need strategic agility. So, one of while there is a QDR only every 4 years, and now it's the DSR that's been legislated, I don't think anybody should think that that's the only time that we take a look and do the things that we do during a QDR. What is the strategic environment? How best to make sure to pursue our interests, protect our interests, and protect our friends and allies and our commitments within that strategic environment. And to some extent, you make that decision anew every year. You keep looking through, and every time that you see massive changes in the security environment. And I would say that to a large extent, that's what we feed into the processes that then go into where are we making changes in the budget in terms of relative emphasis. So that's an important piece, and it's something that we always struggle with, was how do you do a better job of assessing how you're doing and where you're going. On the other hand, I don't, changing massive changes to strategic guidance every 6 months, every year, that's not good for the department either. You've got to have some level of consistency so that people understand and are not flitting back and forth between multiple things. So it's finding that, dare I say, balance that is the key. But there are lots of things that I think, as Mike noted, that are consistent within the budget that we've been doing for a long time while you make changes on the margin. I will say one thing of being more agile is a focus that this deputy secretary is very much pushed and that we see across the department, which is wargaming. How can you discover new things about how to operate, where to operate, how to use things? In an environment where you're pushing innovation, a lot of that is going to be about wargaming. And there is money specifically tied to incentivizing wargaming within the department starting in the 16 budget and on. So I think combining all of those and having a sense of understanding that in fact some things are consistent, right? We have alliance commitments. We have things we are always going to be able to have to do to project power into areas. Understanding what's consistent while understanding that you can't be so happy with the work you've done that you don't ever look to challenge that.
All right. And Jamie, a question for you, and I know that this actually goes back, you were Air Force Comptroller before Director of CAPE, and I know that you've been part of this administration's effort to achieve greater efficiencies on how our defense dollars are spent. Some of those have been successful, some haven't, in part because Congress doesn't always agree with what the department wants to do in terms of efficiency initiatives. So my question to you is, looking forward, what legislative or policy obstacles are holding the department back from achieving greater efficiency in how it uses resources?
So it's not a popular answer, but base realignment and closure is an important piece of this. And it's been an aspirational goal for several years now. We're now more than 10 years since our last round. The studies the department has done generally find 20% to 25%, sometimes more, surplus infrastructure in most of our mission areas. Obviously, it varies depending on what part of the force and what capability you're talking about. But it's substantial. The big thing that plays there is not so much the costs of maintaining facilities or owning more real estate than you need. It's the people that come with that. When I worked for the Air Force, our walking around rough order estimate was it took 800 to 900 airmen to open a base. Before you had any operational folks there, it was 800 to 900 airmen just to have that base. And so you can understand as you shrink down the operational forces, as we get higher and higher technology, this is particularly an Air Force issue, and the capital gets more and more expensive because it's more and more advanced, we are operating with a constant physical infrastructure with a lot of overhead to maintain it. So base closure is an important piece. It's critical to note that the department is not happy with what happened in the 2005 background in terms of cost takeout. We rebalanced the force in some useful ways, but we think a future background would have a much different financial ramification. Even though the 2005 background is now paying off for the department financially, it was a much smaller scale of closure and large-scale realignment than the previous rounds, which yielded much larger financial savings earlier. And that we would model more on the earlier ones in order to generate more savings. But this is a difficult, a political topic. We understand that. But the department is going to, I think, remain consistent in the message that we just need to move forward on this to enable a whole bunch of cost takeout, to drive more combat capability out of each taxpayer dollar. Now, there's more that we can do there unquestionably beyond that. I think the department needs to look at, broadly speaking, agility in identifying and divesting programs that are not delivering. As we look to an era where we have sort of a near great power competition going on, it is important that we're willing to take enough risk in the things we develop and acquire to maintain that deterrent posture for the long run. Doing that necessitates a portfolio approach in which you do not expect that every investment you make is going to successfully come to fruition. We need to have a risk profile where we do some exotic work that may only have a coin flip or a 20% chance of turning into a military capability. But if you don't do several of those, you're going to be locked in purely incremental improvement. Incremental improvement is important. We need it, but we need a portfolio that has some higher risk efforts. The department's got to be really good at divesting those when it's clear they're not paying off. And that's an area that we are working internally and with Congress to sort of build the understanding. It's difficult to have a portfolio approach with various high-risk technologies if you know you're going to be sorely punished for any failure, even if it was a conscious choice to take risk. Again, as the Secretary looks to models in Silicon Valley, you can't assume that every investment you make is going to pay off. If that's what your assumption, if that's your planning basis, you're not being ambitious enough. Mike may have something he wants to add on this as well, I don't know. Yeah. Or you okay?
Certainly, BRAC is one of the more challenging ones. We've had challenging discussions as well on areas like healthcare over the years. I would say on your first point about agility as well that seeing not only Dr. Hamre but seeing two of my predecessors as comptroller here now, we do have operational agility that requires the financial community to respond. Our organization has always worked with the services and with combatant commanders to respond to year of execution challenges. We're here to talk about planning, programming, budgeting. The process is formally named, execution on the end, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. We don't normally talk about execution that much, but we do have to respond to the here and now contingencies, and we do have, and I do appreciate a reasonable amount of flexibility in our operating accounts and the way that we're allowed to use them and the way that military operations are done through the commander-in-chief. They're not negotiated with the legislative branch exactly how you're going to do those operations on a day-to-day basis. So we do have some inherent flexibilities that we use, but we also need to move money around to address challenges in ways that don't, that are avenues that come off of are more enduring priorities like the Asia-Pacific rebalance. So probably the most dramatic example of that in the recent years was the Ebola response, which was a fairly significant logistic effort and financial effort that was done in the last month of a fiscal year. So having the ability to do that, working with our committees on Congress is important as well as a different kind of agility, what I call an operational agility in addition to strategic agility.
All right. And I also put out a call for questions on Twitter before the event, and I got some good ones. And I want to ask one of Mike. In many years, we see the military pay raise that's proposed by the administration is basically an across-the-board pay raise. The whole pay table goes up, all of the ranks at once. One of the challenges with that, of course, is that over time, if you have across-the-board pay raises, it widens the gap in pay between the higher ranks and lower ranks because the higher ranks grow actually at a faster amount because they're starting from a higher base. So from time to time, the department has used targeted pay raises at certain parts of the pay scale, based on recruiting and retention needs. Is that something that the department has looked at this year, and do you think it's time to look at that again?
I think this year we have, the focus has been, probably the mental focus has been on some of the non-monetary things I described. The Force of the Future initiatives have consumed probably a lot of the bandwidth. We did not have an in-depth discussion of doing a targeted pay raise in lieu of the across-the-board pay raise this year. There's a variety of aspects, reasons for that. I think probably also that the fundamental change in the retirement system is something that we need to work through. I was just out in Indianapolis with my defense finance accounting people end of last week to talk about all the changes we're going to have to do to actually operationalize that and get ready for all the questions that come in. So I think that we've been looking at it. I don't know if non-traditional is the best way to describe it, but in terms of the child care, the maternity and paternity leave aspect, we've just had a change in the retirement as well. We're always, every year there's a discussion of health care, of some ways to make it better while improving ideally both the value and the efficiency of the healthcare delivery system. So I think that pay raise itself is an important part. It's the thing that people think about first. And the virtue of it is also that it's most easily changed if we do see that we're getting something wrong on the recruiting and retention side, but we haven't been seeing that. And so I don't think the case has been made that I've been aware of to go target it instead of across the board at this time. But it is something that we could do fairly easily if we or a future administration decided that changes needed to be made at the margin. I will say finally that there are some pockets certainly where in fact you have the opposite problem of pay compression between various grades, not a widening but a compression as well.
All right. So with that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. We'll start over here. We can wait for microphones coming to you right now.
Good morning. I'm an independent consultant, Hampton Dowling, and I don't think anybody envies the job you have trying to put together a budget when there's so many floating variables and changes of priorities and so forth. But I do most of my business around the world, so I kind of take a note of geopolitics where it affects business agreements and dealings with different ministries and presidents and so forth. And it's interesting that where we have a lot of problems, we do have a lack of presence. And as you try to look at least the Navy budget, it's interesting that all the service chiefs have a common denominator is the lack of and need of an additional carrier battle group. Even to the effect that a Chief of Staff of the Air Force notes that it affects the movement of numbered air forces when there's a delay of a carrier or lack thereof. As you look forward, and I realize that you, in the out years, you can't really, don't know if you're going to be able to raise your base budget lines and so forth, as you mentioned earlier. But is there a sense that maybe we need to add another carrier? And of course, there's a domino effect associated with that, but the numbers seem to be very flat. But I haven't noticed any comment from the Navy on it, but I have from the other service chiefs. Is there any sense of that?
So the department is on a path right now to, again, have 11 carriers out operationally. As you know, we were in a short-term gap where the delays in building the new carrier have left us with really only 10 functional ones. So that is coming up naturally already. I'm not sure if you're arguing to go still further beyond that, which is a pretty big undertaking given the nature of the carrier industrial base. It would be a major, decade-plus endeavor to get to that point. So I don't think it's under serious consideration. The Navy is working hard and has been for a few years now to identify the right ways to optimize the deployment and employment of the fleet in order to produce maximal carrier presence. And we made some conscious choices a couple of years back in the face of some geopolitical situations to surge the carrier force out and provide enhanced presence for a period of about a year, a little less than a year, understanding that the consequence would be we were deferring some maintenance, which meant that we would have more carriers in dock and waiting for dock than we would otherwise have for a short period of time, which we are now just about to start coming out of. So you are, I think, probably seeing a little bit of the regret associated with that past decision to surge, but it was very much a conscious decision made by the then Secretary of Defense based on the world situation. I don't know if you want to add anything from policy.
Beautiful.
All right, right here. Move forward.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. I have a cyber-related question for each of you. The FY17 budget, I think, calls for about $35 billion worth of investments in cyber over the course of the fit-up. So, Mr. McCord, can you give us a breakdown, at least a general breakdown of what that money would be going towards? And Mr. Morin, what are the key programs or capabilities that you're trying to push forward in that budget? And Mr. Scher, what are the top policy issues that you're wrestling with when it comes to using cyber weapons in armed conflict or in scenarios that perhaps don't rise to the level of armed conflict but still require a DoD response? Thank you.
Okay, I think we're still struggling maybe for metrics in the cyber area that are commensurate with some of the ways that we talk about other programs that have been around longer. Our categorization of these, is defense of our own networks is the Secretary's top priority, I think, and then we look at offense, we look at the cyber embeds in a whole larger IT effort that our CIO does a great job of leading. I think the last couple of years we've done a better job of kind of elevating the CIO's role so that we talk about cyber in the context of other issues. One of the things that's been on my plate a lot is the response to the OPM hack, as it was called, which affected mostly DoD people. So we have both our own needs and our own efforts, but also they need to respond to the challenges that come at us from the outside. So the cyber budget, I think Jamie could talk maybe about some of the particular choices we made. There's some that are unclassified. We can talk about many that are not.
Yeah, so I would emphasize in looking at cyber, we are continuing to grow the overall capacity and capability that's resident in U.S. Cybercom and that's resident in the various service components for it. They are understandably focused first on the priority of securing the network, as Mike said. We know that the way the U.S. operates in peacetime, and clearly the way we would operate in the case of a major war, is deeply dependent on the flow of information, and we know that that's a contested environment. We've certainly seen it contested in the commercial sector, where we've had major companies face debilitating hacks, and we know that it's contested, among governments and intelligence agencies and militaries. It is based on that, we have this very clear priority of defending the network first, and we are growing teams that are dedicated to active defense and to testing ourselves. We're building a series of scorecards and metrics that will hold individual sub-organizations to account. Since cyber security is in large respect a discipline process in a distributed organization like the Department of Defense, and so we're finding ways to ensure that commanders at all levels are cognizant of how choices that they're making can affect that cybersecurity. We're also looking at the global environment and asking hard questions about what does it mean to maintain deterrence in a world where cyber can be weaponized. And those are the trickiest questions. They have the most heavy policy overtones, so I think I might use that to toss it to my distinguished colleague here.
Why, thank you. As much as we have done in cyber, I think it's fair to say that there's still more as we think about integrating this domain into the way we think about conflict. And obviously, first is absolutely the protection of our own networks. And then, but from the planning perspective that we go through, we have to ask different questions and figure out how we can use this as an effective tool, and both from a deterrence and a protection perspective. And part of this is going to be, do we have to look at cyber, do we have to have cyber reactions to cyber actions? Or do we look at figuring out how do we integrate cyber into how we think about things writ large? It's still very sensitive and it's still very tightly controlled, as it should be, given the repercussions that could come back, not just on the defense force, but also on the society writ large. So working through each of these issues is important from a theoretical perspective, but frankly, that has to be coupled with what practically you can and can't do to understand how you want to look at it in theory.
Oh, well, we got a lot of questions. How about Tony back there at the back?
Hi, Tony Capacity with Bloomberg News. How does your vision of we have to be able to do it all square with the looming bow wave the next administration starts to face in 2021, when they have to start planning for 2021 next year, basically? How do you square the two? And how much money, roughly, will the next administration have to pony up or have to find starting in 2021 just to pay for the nuclear modernization upgrade, the F-35 ramp up, B-21, SSBNX? How do you square your two goals that we have to do it all, yet we have to navigate a major bow wave coming?
Sure. A great question, Tony, unsurprisingly. So just one clarification for the group. This year's Future Years Defense Plan is the first one in which the real bulk of that nuclear bow wave is now within the planning horizon. FY21 represents the target procurement date for the first of the Navy's Ohio replacement submarines. And So we are looking at a substantial ramp up, and I don't know if we still have slides here. I think we might not. If you looked closely at Mike's final slide, what we call in the defense business the spaghetti chart, you will see that the last year of the future year's defense plan that was shown up there for this cycle, the 2017 budget and the 2017 through 2021 future year's defense plan, shows a tick up in the defense top line in FY21. And that was the product of a very serious and deliberate discussion between the leadership of the Department of Defense and the senior staff at the White House all the way up to the President about this upcoming nuclear modernization bow wave. And specifically, substantial bills in that year with regard to both the Ohio replacement with the funding for the first ship's procurement, and then also some significant costs for both the ICBM replacement and the bomber, although those grew less year over year than did the submarine. So we had a very serious dialogue about that, and in response, the President gave the department fiscal planning targets that were greater than those that were projected the previous cycle. It doesn't represent the whole of the bow wave that you're talking about. That bow wave will grow significantly, particularly by the time we get to the mid-2020s and the late 2020s when the Ohio replacement submarine is in serial production, one a year. Right now, we're building one, we'll have 2 years of gap, and we're incrementally funding, or planning to incrementally fund that submarine over those 3 years. So you can envision once we're to one a year, that's going to be a very substantial increase. It's on the order of 12 to 18 billion a year above sort of where we were over this last decade, which was a period of very low investment in the nuclear enterprise. Investment for the department in the nuclear enterprise is cyclical, right? The nuclear weapons establishment of the United States was fielded post-World War II, was modernized and updated under Eisenhower, was modernized and updated under Reagan. And while the programs, they crest and trough based on those cyclical modernizations, we are coming up now on another period of growth. Each of those modernizations in history has been aligned with a period of increasing top line for the Department of Defense. So what the FY21 projection in the future years defense plan lays out is really the start of a ramping back up. But obviously that will be a decision a new administration will have to make, and maybe even the administration after the next administration, depending on how future elections come, before we really get to FY21, FY22, FY23, and deal with these.
And I would just add that there's in your question, Tony, it was stated as how do you square, and the you in English, unlike French, is the same word for one person or many. There's certainly a DoD-specific aspect of trades within the defense budget, but it's really a larger national question of how much are we willing to pay for defense when you get to that era. And that's something that cannot be limited to just us, which is why we started the conversation with the White House, but it involves the Congress and ultimately the American people as well. Are we willing to make that investment? We saw the same discussion, absent the particular focus on the nuclear triad in last fall's budget discussion of how much are you willing to pay. Our request was up here, we didn't get it all. People were not willing to pay in terms of tax increases or cutting other programs to the full extent that we sought. And that same discussion will be had with maybe more importance and more at stake when you get to this point.
And let me add just one more quick point on that, Tony, which is we conducted a nuclear strategic portfolio review as well. And what we did with that, among other things, is we looked very carefully at what were the department's options to pay for nuclear modernization sort of within the strategic forces, within the nuclear forces budget. And it very quickly became apparent that unless the department was willing to divest the submarine leg of the triad, which we're not, there was no way to pay for that modernization within the budget, because it was really, the bow wave you're talking about, because it is an ebb and flow kind of thing, is a doubling of what we need to spend on nuclear. So you would have to look beyond the portfolio. Even if you chose to do radical things within the portfolio, it would not come close to paying for that whole bill.
Let's go to Otto here.
Auto Chrysler with C-Power Magazine. This is for Mr. McCord. The administration has said consistently that the defense budget you've presented matches the two-year budget deal from last year. The Republicans in Congress are constantly saying you're $7 to $18 billion short of what you were allowed under the budget deal. The numbers just don't seem to match up. So could you explain to us, where you're matching the two-year deal or where you're not?
Thank you. Yes. Well, in our view, or in my view, we did match the deal. The deal has a base budget number and an OCO number in it. The base budget number includes other entities like the nuclear NNSA as well. So obviously it doesn't track directly to a Department of Defense target, but it's fairly obvious we're about 95% of that. On the OCO side, which I think is where maybe more of the discussion has been, there's an OCO number in the deal, and there's language in the deal. It's the same number and the same language in both 16 and 17. And we treated it the same way that Congress treated it last year. Congress wrote to that number last year in the Omnibus Appropriations Bill. We submitted a budget to that number this year in the budget deal. I'm well aware that at one point there was drafted that language that had wording about it being not less than. That wording is not what was passed by the Congress or signed by the President. So I don't think it's all that unclear. And I have heard some of those discussions or some of those concerns raised. I will point out when the Secretary appeared at his first hearing, that was not raised to him by any member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, that I recall. So I don't think it's actually that much of a dispute, or that it should be unclear. I mean, there was budget deals, budget numbers in budget acts tend to be ceilings, and that's how we viewed, and that's certainly how the administration viewed this number.
All right, let's go over here.
Hello, Tony Bertuga, Inside Defense. I wanted to turn the discussion to the practice of the services sending unfunded priorities lists to Congress. So these have readily been leaked out to Capitol Hill. The Secretary has not had a chance to provide input yet to what's been leaked. Does he still, one, reserve the prerogative to modify what the services send to Congress? And two, do the three of you see value in continuing this because it essentially sidesteps civilian oversight of the budget process? Thank
you. This process began sometime in my career. I want to say at least 20 years now we've had this, and it has its good and its bad points. I think it is disappointing that these lists get out so soon before the Secretary's had time to review them. They do have some value in the process and illuminating marginal, at the margin where additional pressure might be or is perceived to be within the services. The problem in this particular instance is, as we just had in the previous question, there's an agreed-to top line. So, taking money just to pick a service at random, if there was something you picked off a Navy list, it would have to come at the expense of somebody else. And we've already had well thought out discussions in the department about what our priorities are, which are reflected in what we've already sent. So I think absent some unusual or unexpected change in the budget situation, it's less helpful this time than usual.
Yeah, I mean, every individual decision is interesting and useful unto itself, but if you can't balance it against the entire portfolio and understand where you're accepting risk in a zero-sum game, then that is not as useful. So I think, as Mike said, and that's what we spend a number of months doing, is trying to look at allocating risk across the portfolio in the best way that the Secretary thinks. And so then changing one-off decisions really does change that whole risk calculation and balance portfolio.
We understand, of course, that chiefs are asked this question, and ultimately they're going to, as they have for over 2 decades now, respond to the question.
And just as a status update, right now the Secretary is awaiting the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recommendation associated with the lists that the individual service chiefs have sent to the chairman.
All right. Let's go to Pat back here.
I would just note by preface that the congressional role is a part of civilian oversight, okay, and Congress asked for the list, just for the record. The uncertainty of the budget the last 5 years that you guys have had to wrestle with, and it isn't going to damp out anytime soon. So you have to think about budgetary agility. Mike, when you were here back in the end of November, you said that sacrificing force structure to accommodate the budget cuts, it takes too long to reverse if you get lucky on the money, and so you didn't want to do that. What about the high end of current readiness? I mean, current readiness doesn't have much shelf life, and the high end of full spectrum readiness, a full up NTC run, multi-ship on multi-ship red flag, that's expensive stuff. In 94 and 95, Senator Nunn and Ed Luttwak, two people with an association with this fine institution, they suggested that you take a serious look, as we came out of Desert Storm, take a serious look at tiered readiness, and the blowback from the uniforms was ferocious. The force was going to collapse, nobody wants to be on the B team, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. Have you seen, as the services have had to accommodate the uncertainty of the last few years and look forward to uncertainty, have you seen any effort by the services the phrase that Sam used, I remember, was train the force to get ready, so that you had, the A team is up on the firing step, ready to go, but everybody isn't ready to get on the plane right now because they can't all make it. Is there any attempt to modulate the current readiness, again, particularly at the high end of the spectrum, to give you some flex, some budgetary flex, given this year-to-year uncertainty?
Well, let me take a quick stab at that, and I'll ask my colleagues to respond as well. The first thing that strikes me is, yes, it is correct that I think making a force structure change in response to a short-term budget signal is a problematic undertaking, and you didn't see us really walk away from our force structure plans to accommodate the BBA deal from last fall. On the readiness side, I think the primary difference between the time you described and now is the heavy degree of contingency operations that are ongoing in multiple theaters, and I think that has necessarily consumed the attention of the readiness community, of the service providers, the services that is, as well as the combatant commanders, so that we have probably a different problem, a more compelling problem in the readiness space, is just how to maintain as much full spectrum readiness as you can, given the amount of time, effort, manpower, logistics that we've had to devote to Iraq and Afghanistan and operations like that in recent years. So I think as we all looked at this program and this budget, and I asked Jamie to comment here, most of us felt, I think most of the leadership of the department felt, that if anything, that we wish the readiness recovery rate toward a more idealized full spectrum readiness was too slow, not too fast, and didn't choose to take any more risk in that than we already were.
Yeah, I'd add 2 points that I think are very important to thinking about this issue. First, and just in a background sense, the large parts of the force are by their nature tiered in readiness. The Navy, of course, is out and then back, and we need to give people at least a little time with their families, so they go through an ebb and flow of readiness. The Army, in today's world, where it is a rotational Army out in the world, either in a combat zone or in rotational support of our day-to-day activity in Korea and Europe, elsewhere, is now increasingly in the same sort of mode. Get up on the step, go forward, then come home and take a little bit of a breather. So you have what we used to call the Army Force Generation Cycle. You have the Navy Optimized Fleet Response Plan. Both of those are about managing the force through those ebbs and flows of activity and the readiness associated with them. The Air Force has been the most reluctant to accept any sort of cycle like that, although, again, operational tempo and the fact that they've been forward more than they might prefer has also driven them to a little bit of that ebb and flow. So that is a reality in the world, and it's different than sort of the garrison force that Senator Nunn was looking at 25 years ago. The second important point is that if you are an individual service member, you progress through a career and you have a succession of experiences through that career. And if you're an Army infantry company commander, you'll be in that command a couple of years. If your unit happens to be in a tiered readiness state, a true tiered readiness state in the way that people advocate for it. You know, A team, B team. If you happen to be in the tiered readiness unit, you will not have experiences at that point in your career that you will never be able to make up later in your career because you will have progressed on. We are an institution made up of a bunch of individual human beings that have to work as a team, and we have to be conscious of the fact that shaking up these kinds of things has consequences there. We saw that in the sequestration year. You know, I was the acting undersecretary of the Air Force at the time. We had to stand down red flag operations because we were out of money. We had to furlough civilians and stand down the red flag high-end exercises because we were out of money. And the men and women in those units that were scheduled to have that experience didn't and may not. They will miss that. If you're in the Army unit that misses your NTC rotation because they had to cut back, you will not. And so we have to be extraordinarily cautious about swinging that lever. And that is, I think, why this administration has put an extremely high priority on protecting readiness funding, even if it meant we had to do deeper cuts on some of these modernization programs. And I think what you see Secretary Carter now doing is trying to shift that balance a little bit back more toward capabilities, recognizing that our foundation of deterrence rests on capability, capacity, and readiness.
And not to belabor the point, but a focus on ready for what is what we always have to ask ourselves. And the fact is that given that the shift, the direction that we were shifting in terms of being ready to deal with great power adversaries potentially, means that we really do need to make sure we have that full spectrum focus. When we were ready and putting ready forces into Afghanistan and Iraq, they were ready for those missions, but arguably not ready for full spectrum against a near peer adversary. We're still in the process of adjusting to getting ready for what the Secretary has told us to. So I think that's a big focus of why you aren't, another piece of why you're not seeing money being taken out of full spectrum readiness training.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time. I promised I would get these gentlemen out of here by 10:30, and I know there are many other questions, but you can save them for the next panel discussions coming up next. But please join me in thanking these three distinguished panelists.